Hello and welcome to this episode of the Geoeconomic Agenda, a podcast from the Institute of Geoeconomics at the Asia-Pacific Initiative in Tokyo that investigates the connection between economics, geopolitics, business, and society. I'm your host, Paul Nadeau, and I'm a visiting researcher here at the IOG. In a moment, we'll talk to Kevin Wolf, a partner at the Akin Gump law firm in Washington, D.C., and former Assistant Secretary for Export Administration at the U.S. Department of Commerce, to get his thoughts on the future of export control policy and what it means for the future of commerce. But first, here's the latest news from the world of geoeconomics. On Tuesday, March 28, Japan and the United States agreed to a deal to prohibit bilateral export restrictions on minerals critical to the production of electric vehicles. It also requires the two sides to collaborate on combating non-market policies and practices of other states in the critical minerals trade, as well as conducting investment reviews of foreign investments in their critical mineral supply chains. The agreement will enable Japanese vehicles to qualify for the EV tax credits provided in the Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA, which allowed tax credits for EV purchases to be expanded to those using minerals extracted and processed from countries with whom the United States has a free trade agreement, which initially excluded Japan and the European Union. The United Kingdom reached an agreement on March 31st to join the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, becoming the group's 12th member just over 2 years after its initial application. Its ascension is notable because it is the first non-founding member to apply for membership under the agreement's ascension process, in this case chaired by Japan. China and Taiwan are the next two economies in line to have applied to join the CPTPP, followed by Ecuador, Costa Rica, and Uruguay. Also on March 31st, the U.S. Treasury Department issued its guidance on the electric vehicle tax credits offered in the IRA that was passed last summer, and uses a more expansive definition of free trade agreement in order to allow EU and Japanese auto manufacturers to qualify for the credits. Members of Congress have expressed their displeasure with the guidance, believing that the administration has redefined the intent of the legislation while also circumventing Congress's role in regulating international trade. Senate Finance Committee Chair Ron Wyden and Ranking Member Mike Crapo both said that the guidance does not remove the Biden administration's obligation to submit the agreement on critical minerals with Japan to Congress for their approval. Meanwhile, EU Trade Chief Valdis Dombrovskis has said that EU negotiators are seeking clarity on the proposed guidance, specifically on the extent of minerals covered and its compliance with the rules set out with the IRA before signing any agreement on critical minerals. French President Emmanuel Macron visited China from April 5th to the 8th and met with Xi Jinping, where they discussed, among other things, a trade agreement that would be called From French Farm to Chinese Table. Macron traveled to China with a delegation of 50 business leaders, including the CEOs of Airbus and EDF, and several commercial deals were reached during the course of the visit. At the same time, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, who had joined Macron on the visit, expressed concern that Europe's trade relations with China were becoming increasingly imbalanced. There were also concerns in the United States and elsewhere that Macron was prioritizing French economic relations with China at the expense of concerns over the future of Taiwan or China's potential support for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This is the Geoeconomics Agenda with Paul Nadeau. Today I'm sitting down with Kevin Wolf. He's a partner at Akin Gump, a law firm in Washington, D.C., and he's former Assistant Secretary for Export Administration at the U.S. Department of Commerce, where he was responsible for export control and licensing. Today we're going to talk to him about the future of export control policy, not just in the United States, but in the world in general. What's changed, what's changing, and what needs to change. So, Kevin, thank you very much for joining us today.
Happy to be here.
So, October 2022, the Biden administration announced a new set of export controls towards China. What are they and why were they announced?
They are a very complex, novel set of rules that have 4 objectives. to regulate all of the inputs necessary for the indigenous development in China of 1, advanced node semiconductors, 2, semiconductor production equipment, 3, the advanced computing elements necessary for artificial intelligence, and 4, supercomputers. And they are novel in that they are focused on one country. They control items leaving the United States. They control non-US made items made with US technology or equipment. And they control activities of US persons, whether individuals or companies. The reason those rules were published by the Biden administration is a reflection of a national security judgment by the Biden administration that the existence of those capabilities in China is a per se national security threat. Even if the individual semiconductors or other items are used exclusively in commercial applications. And it's not part of a trade protectionist objective, although that's what most people characterize it as. It's not part of a broader US-China decoupling effort. Rather, it's a reflection of an assessment by the Biden administration as announced by the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, that these are enabling technologies that are needed to give China a military advantage. And the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, has made it clear of their plans to use these technologies to modernize their military. So the Biden administration took this rather dramatic and novel action in order to respond to that national security threat.
So you talked before about how what we're seeing now is a transformation in export controls. What was the goal of export controls before, say 5 years ago, give or take? And what's the goal of export controls now? What's changed exactly?
Right. So during the Cold War, the purpose of export controls was to achieve broader strategic objectives to limit the flow of commercial and military and other items to the Soviet Union and the East Bloc. At the end of the Cold War, Japan and the United States and other allies narrowed substantially the focus of regulation of items moving across borders and technologies to those that were either weapons of mass destruction, conventional weapons, or the parts, components, software, and technology necessary for their development, production, or use. And economic considerations were not factored in, and broader country-specific issues were not factored in. And that objective was codified in 4 different multilateral arrangements that Japan and the US are both charter members. The most famous one, if you will, is the Wassenaar Arrangement, which regulates items that have conventional military applications. And that purpose of controls, because all regulations exist to achieve an objective, they don't achieve or exist for their own purpose, was fairly stable in the 1990s and the 2000s, and really for the first part of when I was in government. And what started to change is Chinese state policy to use commercial items to commit human rights abuses, such as with respect to mass surveillance, to modernize its military as part of its military civil fusion policies, and to achieve strategic economic dominance objectives with respect to key technologies such as semiconductors in order to be able to dominate global markets. And so in 2017 and 18, there was a very public bipartisan debate in the United States about how export control policy should be expanded. And new authorities were given to my old bureau, the Commerce Department, to identify emerging and foundational technologies that were essential to national security, but that didn't meet that classical weapons-focused approach. But the Trump administration and the first year of the Biden administration never really identified a clear, coherent vision of what those new objectives should be. They each took a lot of individual actions, but it wasn't until after the Allied response to the Russia continued invasion of Ukraine that the Allies came together and started to, with respect to Russia, use controls for a broader strategic objective. And then the next time, again, was in October with the China-specific controls. So it's really been an evolution of an expansion of the policy objectives, and exactly where it will end, no one really knows. We're at a very exciting time for export control policy because it's as significant of a policy discussion and debate now as was the case at the end of the Cold War.
So you talked about no one's really quite sure where this is going to go next. That said, there've got to be, say, 2, 3 futures that are possible. Do you think that these are going to become more strict? In what way? What are some of the possibilities that you think this may be able to go from here? Right.
So long as the Chinese Communist Party is in charge in China, and so long as Putin or his successors are in charge in Russia, the rules will definitely not be getting more liberal. and even after those two things change, as all things do, the concept of the purpose of export controls, at least in the United States, has been so baked in to think differently about contemporary national security issues that didn't really exist in 1996 when the current system was established. And that's where the emphasis on these enabling technologies, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, advanced node semiconductors, supercomputers, for example, is so vital to US and allied investment policy into the countries, as well as tech transfer and investment policies out of the country. So there's 2 realistic futures and 1 non-realistic future. One most likely future is the continued tweaking of this vision that I described earlier to make it more effective, to enhance enforcement, particularly on diversion of commercial items into Russia, to align better with allies along the lines of what Japan did about 2 weeks ago with its proposed rules. And that, I think, is the most likely outcome of regular tweaking of this grand vision and eventually coming into more ad hoc plurilateral arrangements. If, however, the Chinese government begins to endorse or allow significant support for the Russian military, or engages in hostile militaristic actions toward Taiwan, even more so than it has recently, then the calls, both by the US and other close allies, I suspect, to dramatically increase the scope of what are otherwise very tailored new controls will expand considerably. And so those are the two. The less likely future is that we return to a world where controls are just focused on items that have an identifiable a military relationship. There's also a less likely possibility that controls will be used for trade protectionist reasons. I know that that's discussed often, but I see that as highly unlikely in the US and certainly with the allies.
But the temptation to use things like that for protectionism has got to be there. I mean, I know you're one of the foremost experts on this, and I think you argue rather convincingly, at least I'm convinced, that this is not an issue of protectionism. But as long as you have tools like this, I feel like the temptation to use these not just for security purposes, but also commercial purposes will always kind of be there in the background. So is there a way that you can prevent that from happening, hedge against that happening? If I was a congressman, for example, I would, kind of be giving that a side eye and thinking, I might be able to use this for my district.
Right. So. It all goes to how you define national security. Because by definition, everything that we're speaking about, all of the new controls are exclusively commercial items for civil applications. And what has changed is a policy consideration of what constitutes a national security objective that is far broader than just the specific component that's needed to make the missile. And so your question had it as an either or, when really the discussion is at what point is regulation of a purely commercial item for civil end use a national security objective? And that's where the discussion is. And because it's such a novel, difficult, nebulous topic where the same words can mean different things to different people, there's a lot of public confusion out there in the debate. And that's what I meant earlier, that we're right at the cusp of a rather significant transformation of this as a policy topic. And because of all of the truly, actual trade protectionist policies that are taking place, the 301 tariffs in the United States, the 232 tariffs that are in the guise of national security that are actually far broader, the perception of the Inflation Reduction Act or the guardrails associated with the CHIPS Act and the Biden administration and Trump administration's objectives of primary objectives of more manufacturing in the United States and distrust for free trade agreements as inherently harmful to workers in the United States. I can see how most people would think that these policies are all blending together. And unless governments are very careful to distinguish the national security objective with the trade protectionist objective, the messages can be quite muddled. So
touching on that a little bit, you're on a whirlwind tour of Japan right now. I'm certain you've been taking this talk to various other capitals across the world. What's the reaction been like? How have the people that you've spoken to reacted to these rules? What kind of questions do they ask? Are they receptive? Are they skeptical? Are they somewhere in between? What's the general reaction, such that you can offer a general reaction?
Yeah, I have this wonderful position in life where what I do for a living is as an attorney, and I provide legal advice on how to comply with these rules. That's how I make my money. But I'm also a former senior government official who was prominent in an area that's become front and center as a policy topic. And so for the greater good, because I'm a true believer in the virtue and the value of export controls to advance common interests, I go out and I speak, just like today and here today, and thank you for inviting me. The reaction is generally grateful that I can explain these complex issues simply. I try anyway. And that I am getting a public discussion about what the objectives are. I have a fairly simple message, which is, in order to know what should be controlled, you first have to define the problem to be solved. That's the first rule of regulation. And so I try to have a discussion about what problem are we trying to solve. The second rule of regulation is make sure that whatever you're doing in terms of new controls is both effective, meaning it will deprive the adversary of the items of concern, and not counterproductive, meaning in the course of doing so, you hurt your own industry and national security objectives. And so I try to filter all of my commentary through those two rules of policymaking, in a very simple way. And so the first reaction is gratitude for that. I think that's sort of that very simple, but to the point. And as we had, today in your meeting, a discussion of what does this mean for industry? Will this hurt us? Will it make trade more uncertain? Will it make it more difficult to do business in commercial items with China or the United States or other countries? What's your vision of what the new regime of close allies would look like? What would be its mandate? What technologies would it cover? What are the details? So the types of questions that I get into are along those lines. And my personal motive is anything I can do to help have a more coherent discussion of this very important area is ultimately for the greater good.
So to follow up on that a little bit, a lot of what this depends on is a certain view of what China has been doing domestically and the future trajectory of its government and its approach towards its people, towards its minority populations, towards its neighbors, and so on. And there isn't a lot of uniformity globally on what that trajectory is. And so I think a lot of these things, if companies are going to take a hit on this, is inevitable, even if it's for the greater good. You're going to be taking a hit one way or another. How do you, I'm using the second person plural here, which we don't have. That's one pronoun we don't have in English, but not just you, but people in Washington, right, the Biden administration, and so on and so forth. How do you make the case that China is a threat in the way that the United States is framing it? How do you convince people about that?
Evidence. Yeah. With the post-Cold War thinking, it was much more apparent. You have a weapon, you have a missile. You need a semiconductor guidance device, a nozzle, something that will make that missile fly. That missile flies, it lands, it kills people. That's very direct, and you don't need a lot of explanation. And that's all, of course, very legitimate and continuing, and I don't want to take away from any of the classical arms control or non-proliferation efforts with what I'm discussing. But the US government, frankly, is the country that's leading this charge. I agree with you, needs to do a better job of making the connection of how is a 14 nanometer semiconductor, a 128 layer NAND memory chip. How is that possibly a national security threat? Isn't that really just an economic opportunity to sell the tools to make that item to China? Mm-hmm. And you're right. Most allies, as good and close of allies as they are, in many parts of their capitals see China as an economic opportunity. And there's many of them also slowly realizing to different degrees, and I think the French President Macron discussion really highlighted how complex this issue is among the allies in the view toward China. And I do think, and this is part of my role as a former government official, trying to explain what that novel, non-classical, more precisely, national security issue is with respect to China. And I boil it down to those three changes. One, the use of commercial technologies to commit human rights abuses, particularly mass surveillance. Second, state policies requiring the finding of commercial enabling technologies such as that related to AI and advanced computers to modernize the military, which is directed against us, against Japan, against the United States, against other allies. And the use of state policies and subsidies to achieve strategic economic dominance to dominate key inputs for countries to be able to function efficiently. Very similar to the Japanese economic security mandate. Mm-hmm. And I and others need to be explaining that not just to other governments, but to industry of the other countries as well. So it's a long way of saying I agree with the point of your question.
So also, what if, to stay on the cynics for a little bit, of course, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there was, a historic level of economic controls, sanctions, etc., placed on the Russian government in response to the invasion. Obviously, that invasion is ongoing.
Right.
It's still brutal. Russia's still able to achieve, some meaningful battlefield victories. So I think one counterpoint to all of this could say, well, we've had all these export controls on Russia, and look, the war is still ongoing. Maybe these don't work. Yep. What's to say if they don't work in Russia, and for those of you listening at home, I'm using air quotations right now. If they don't work in Russia, what's to say they will work in China? What's to say that, these things will keep on going without export controls having a meaningful difference on all of this?
Yeah, excellent point. Well, the first issue, the way to win a war is to win a war with weapons, and lots of them, and training. And so nobody should take away that export controls can win any war. And that's a whole separate topic. And also, no one should believe that export controls will ever be perfect. There will always be gaps. There will always be escapes. There will always be diversion. There always has been. But what export controls can do, and their big sister sanctions, which are economic limitations on transactions, can limit and delay and degrade the ability, in the Russia case, on a strategic level, to get the key inputs that are not available in order to repair and maintain its vehicles and military systems and weapons and aircraft. And sure, the controls will stop 80% of the semiconductors that are needed to keep a military vehicle functioning in Ukraine by the Russian military, but that's better than zero. And so that's where Allied coordination and enforcement will just gradually keep moving that number up and always evolving. But obviously, China is not Russia. Russia is completely dependent upon the West for these key inputs, particularly in semiconductors and civil aircraft and the other components. And China is far more independent, of course, in each of these key sectors. And there isn't an invasion of another country that catalyzes public sentiment as clearly as the Russian invasion against Ukraine. And so my point and my vision, and which is, I think dovetails nicely with the Biden administration, is that we need to start educating our allies, not educating, that's a poor use of word, that's condescending, to working with our allies through both informal, ad hoc, plurilateral arrangements, like the recent semiconductor production equipment topic, as well as, in my vision, more formal systems and arrangements among allies to create within the governments of the allies the authorities to be able to move effectively without being counterproductive as this national security threat that is China evolves. And I would also add, as the issue of human rights abuses that occur with commercial technologies becomes more widely accepted as something that needs to be responded to. Again, that's a long way of saying that China is not Russia. It will be far more difficult. The catalyzing event isn't as obvious as in the invasion of another country, but that still means that work needs to be done by the allies on creating this message, creating the resources, and ensuring a common vision.
So finally, and you touched on this before briefly, how long can we expect these export controls to remain in place? And you sort of alluded to the fact that as long as the Chinese Communist Party is in power, there's going to be some export control regime that the U.S. and its partners will have on China. Is that really as long as the time frame for these things being in place? Are there measures? Is there a point at which we might be able to roll back these controls, or is this the future?
If you look, I've been doing this 30 years. I've been working in export controls as a professional since 1993. And the people that I learned this from had been working in export controls for 30 and 40 years. And I, like you, am a student of history, and we see how radically different over the course of decades things change. In 1996, the point of Wassenaar was to bring Russia into the non-proliferation multilateral arrangements. That was the objective. During the Reagan administration, there were radical decontrols on trade with China. The Clinton administration and the Bush administration saw it as an economic opportunity, had it join the World Trade Organization, and had all these wonderful visions of it changing its policies. So over the course of decades, you can have complete shifts in relationships between countries, and it has occurred since the beginning of time. So that's why I'm saying at that pace of time, like over decades, clearly history has shown there could be change. But in our professional lifetimes, it's probably, I'm 56, I can't tell how old you are, but it's going to be, this type of activity, and I think in an ever more aggressive way for many, 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 many years. And so what I'm trying to do is emphasize the first and second rules of regulation. First, identify clearly the problem to be solved with evidence, that is working with the allies. And then second, do so in a way that's both effective and not counterproductive. Because there's going to be a reason for these controls, particularly with respect to China and Russia, for many, many years.
Any final parting thoughts you'd like to leave with our listeners?
Yes. So obviously I'm in Japan, and I think all of your listeners should really understand that the relationship between Japan and the United States is as close as it possibly could be in sort of every respect, military, economic, culturally, et cetera. And so whatever the difficulties in this new way of thinking, it shouldn't be taken for any sort of belief that in the United States, Japan is any less of an ally. And I would use that situation, that fact, that reality, as really an opportunity to increase the ability of Japanese and U.S. companies and the Japanese and the U.S. governments to reduce friction, to reduce barriers, to create opportunities for more joint development, more joint production of these emerging technologies, for more military coordination and cooperation and interoperability. And so for the hit, as you put it, or the issue and the complexity of China and Russia, use that difficult situation as an opportunity to look at better ways in which the two countries can work together. So that's my hopelessly positive vision of the future of the relations between the two countries. And I'm glad you asked me to talk today, and I'm happy to keep discussing in the future. So.
Well, this is certainly an issue that we're going to revisit in the future going forward, because, like you said, this is a direction that both our countries are going to be focused on in the future. So, Kevin Wolf, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to possibly speaking again in the future.
Great. Happy to help. Thanks for asking.
This is the Geoeconomics Agenda with Paul Nadeau. Finally, earlier in the show, we mentioned the UK's successful ascension to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now, our geographically inclined listeners might have been asking themselves how on earth Britain qualifies as a Pacific economy, given that the UK is very clearly in the North Atlantic. The answer is the Pitcairn Islands, a group of 4 isolated islands in the South Pacific, 55,000 kilometers away from New Zealand. Population, 47. The Pitcairn Islands are a British overseas territory, the same status as Bermuda or the Cayman Islands or Gibraltar. The inhabitants of these territories are legally British nationals, their head of state is the British monarch, and while they all have a degree of self-governance, all legislation must be reviewed by the UK government, and the UK itself is responsible for their defence and their foreign relations. And the Pitcairn Islands are the only British overseas territory in the Pacific, following Hong Kong's return to China in 1997. But while the Pitcairn Islands might have given the UK a legal foothold in the Pacific, it's a lot less certain that they could expand the UK's economic foothold. There are no ports or natural harbours on the only inhabited island, so a longboat is necessary to shuttle products from the island to any ship stopping by. Pitcairn Islanders are mostly self-sufficient, with lots of fruit and other agricultural products growing on the island, and with plenty of fish in the surrounding waters, so there's not much need for food imports, but also not much that's produced for exports. Electricity is limited to mornings and evenings to allow islanders to prepare breakfast and dinner, and as of 2020, there was only one licensed high-voltage electrician on the islands to manage the electrical grid. Tourism is important, but with no airport and no natural harbors, it's also very limited. Still, there's a bit of irony to the Pitcairn Islands giving the UK a legal claim to being a Pacific power. The island's population are descendants of the crew and passengers of the HMS Bounty, of Mutiny on the Bounty fame. 9 of the mutineers settled on the main island and burned the Bounty in what's now called Bounty Bay and broke all ties with the British Crown. Eventually, though, the islands were reclassified as part of Britain's Pacific colonies, and now the UK is in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That's all for this episode, but stay tuned for more on the way. Until then, we want to know what you want to hear about, as well as take your questions for our show. So send us an email at geoeconomicagenda@ihj.global. Be sure to like, rate, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, tell your friends, and most of all, keep listening. Thanks for joining us. Thanks to the team at API for making this happen, and we'll talk to you next time.